Gate B-47 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was supposed to be a brief stop on Morgan Freeman's journey to New York. The 6:30 p.m. flight to JFK had been delayed twice, first for weather, then for mechanical issues. The kind of airline speak that meant everyone would be settling in for a long wait. Morgan adjusted his reading glasses and opened the script he'd been reviewing, but something made him look up. 2 seats over, an elderly man sat hunched forward, his shoulders shaking with the kind of silent sobs that come from a grief too deep for sound. The man was well-dressed, but disheveled, as if he'd thrown on expensive clothes without caring how they looked. His gray hair was uncombed, his tie slightly askew. Most telling were his hands. They trembled as he clutched a manila envelope, holding it like it contained either salvation or destruction. Other passengers had noticed too, but looked away, the way people do when confronted with someone else's raw pain. There's an unspoken rule in airports. Mind your own business, get to your destination, don't get involved. But Morgan Freeman had never been good at following unspoken rules when someone was hurting. "Excuse me," Morgan said gently, moving to the empty seat between them. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you all right?" The man looked up, startled. His eyes were red-rimmed, haunted. For a moment, recognition flickered across his face, the slight widening that happens when someone realizes they're talking to a famous person. But grief had stripped away normal social responses. "I'm sorry," the man said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I shouldn't be in public like this." "There's no wrong place to grieve," Morgan replied, his voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had comforted millions through documentaries and films. "I'm Morgan." "Richard," the man managed. "Richard Caldwell." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of comfortable quiet that Morgan had learned was sometimes more valuable than words. Around them, the airport hummed with its usual chaos. Delayed flight announcements, children crying, travelers rushing to make connections. But in their small corner, time seemed suspended. 27 years old," Richard said suddenly, as if continuing a conversation they'd already started. "That's all he got. 27 years. Morgan waited, understanding that Richard needed to talk more than he needed to be asked questions. "My son, David," Richard continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He took his own life 3 days ago. I'm coming back from making the arrangements." The envelope in Richard's hands contained the remnants of a young life. Insurance papers, a death certificate, the clinical documentation that reduces a person to statistics and signatures. "I'm sorry for your loss," Morgan said, and something in his tone made Richard look at him directly for the first time. "Everyone keeps saying that," Richard said. "They say they're sorry, they say it gets better, they say he's in a better place, but nobody says what I need to hear." "Which is?" "That there's still a reason to keep going, because right now, I can't see one." Richard's honesty cut through the air between them like a confession. This wasn't small talk or polite grief. This was a man standing at the edge of his own cliff, looking down into darkness. "Can I tell you something, Richard?" Morgan asked. "Something I've never talked about in interviews?" Richard nodded, though he seemed surprised that the conversation was shifting. "In 1967, I was 29 years old and completely broke," Morgan began. "I'd been trying to make it as an actor for years. I was living in a studio apartment in New York with no heat, eating 1 meal a day, getting rejected at every audition. I'd call my agent, and they'd stopped taking my calls." Morgan's voice took on the rhythm of someone telling a story that still carried pain, even decades later. "I had this neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. sweet old lady who'd sometimes leave soup outside my door when she knew I hadn't eaten. One morning, I found a note under my door. Mrs. Patterson had passed away in her sleep. Richard listened intently, perhaps grateful to focus on someone else's pain instead of his own. At her funeral, I learned something that changed my life. Mrs. Patterson had been supporting 3 children in Haiti, kids she'd never met, sending them money every month from her Social Security check. She'd been doing it for 15 years. Morgan paused, watching a plane taxi slowly pass the window. After the funeral, her daughter came up to me. She said, "Mom always talked about you. She said you had a gift, and that someday you'd use that gift to help people the way she tried to help those children." Then she handed me an envelope. Mrs. Patterson had left me $500, probably every spare penny she had. Richard's grip on his own envelope had loosened slightly. I could have used that money for rent, for food. Instead, I took it to Haiti. I met those 3 children Mrs. Patterson had been supporting. They didn't know her name, but they knew someone far away cared enough to make sure they could go to school. "What does this have to do with—" Richard started, but Morgan held up a gentle hand. "I'm getting there. In Haiti, I met a young man named Jean-Claude. He was about your son's age, and he told me something that stayed with me for 50 years. He said, 'The hardest thing about living isn't the dying. It's finding a reason to wake up when everything feels finished.'" Richard's breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more steady. Jean-Claude had lost his parents, his home, everything. But he kept going because he said someone far away believed in him enough to invest in his future. That belief became his reason. Morgan turned to face Richard fully. What your son was feeling, that darkness, that sense that nothing matters, I've been there. Jean-Claude had been there. Mrs. Patterson had been there too, I learned later. Her husband had died young, left her with nothing. But she found a way to transform her pain into purpose. "But David is gone," Richard said, his voice breaking. "My purpose is gone." "No," Morgan said firmly, but with kindness. "Your purpose is just beginning. David's story doesn't end with his death, Richard. It continues with what you do next." A woman with a stroller bumped into Morgan's chair, apologizing profusely when she recognized him. He smiled and waved off her apologies, but Richard noticed that he didn't break the intense focus of their conversation. "What am I supposed to do?" Richard asked. "I don't understand. I failed him. I didn't see the signs, didn't know how to help him. How can I help anyone else when I couldn't save my own son?" Morgan was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Richard, what did David do for work?" "He was a teacher. Middle school science. He loved those kids, said they reminded him why the world was worth saving." Richard's voice caught. "Ironic, isn't it?" "Not ironic," Morgan said. "Prophetic. David saw meaning in investing in young people, in education, in the future. That's not gone because he is." Richard looked down at the envelope in his hands. "There's a life insurance payout," he said quietly. "David left everything to me. It's substantial. What would David have wanted you to do with it?" The question hung between them like a bridge Richard could choose to cross or not. He always talked about kids who didn't have support at home, kids who were struggling like he was, but didn't have anyone to talk to. "Then there's your answer," Morgan said simply. "But I don't know how to start something like that. I'm a retired accountant. I don't know about foundations or programs or—" "Richard," Morgan interrupted gently. "Mrs. Patterson was a retired seamstress. She didn't know anything about international aid or child sponsorship. She just knew 3 children needed help, and she had the power to provide it. For the first time since they'd started talking, Richard sat up straighter. "The David Caldwell Foundation," he said slowly, as if testing how the words felt. "For young people struggling with mental health," Morgan added. "For teachers who need resources to help students in crisis. For families who need support but don't know where to find it." Richard opened the envelope and pulled out a document. The life insurance paperwork. The number at the bottom was large enough to change lives. David always said his greatest fear was that his students would feel as alone as he did, Richard said, his voice growing stronger. He used to stay after school, just in case a kid needed someone to talk to. "Then you carry that forward," Morgan said. "You make sure no child feels as alone as David did. You turn his pain into someone else's hope." The boarding announcement for their flight finally crackled over the speakers. Around them, passengers began gathering their belongings, checking tickets, preparing for the next phase of their journeys. But Richard remained seated, staring at the papers in his hands. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he admitted. Morgan stood and gathered his own carry-on bag. As he did, he pulled out a business card. Not his agent's or publicist's, but his personal card. "Richard," he said, offering the card. "Strength isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you choose one day at a time, and you don't have to choose alone." Richard took the card, looking at it with the same intensity he'd given the insurance papers. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you talk to me? Why did you tell me those stories?" Morgan smiled, the kind of smile that had made him one of America's most trusted voices. "Because 50 years ago, Mrs. Patterson chose to see potential instead of problems. Because Jean-Claude chose hope instead of despair. Because David chose to teach children instead of giving up on the world." He paused. "And because sometimes, when someone is standing at the edge of their own cliff, all they need is for someone else to show them there's still solid ground to stand on." As they boarded the plane, Richard walked with a different posture. Not the defeated shuffle of a broken man, but the careful steps of someone carrying something precious. 6 months later, Morgan received an invitation in the mail. The David Caldwell Foundation was hosting its first benefit dinner, with proceeds going to mental health programs in schools across Georgia. At the bottom, in Richard's careful handwriting, was a note. "Mr. Freeman, David's story didn't end. It just found a new chapter. Thank you for helping me see that mine didn't have to end either. Richard." Morgan kept that invitation in his wallet, a reminder that sometimes the most important performance isn't the one that happens on screen. Sometimes it's the one that happens in an airport terminal, when someone who has lost everything meets someone willing to help them remember what they still have to give. The flight that night arrived in New York 3 hours late. But both men reached their real destination right on time.